The First Crusade was by far the most successful of all the Crusades. It was quite sort of miraculously successful, and the crusading movement would probably never have got off the ground if it had gone the way of many of the later Crusades. So it's very important in defining the movement. So the people who signed up initially were not, as in many later Crusades, kings and emperors, but they were the rank immediately below that, dukes and counts and such like. And that was quite important because had an emperor or a king led the First Crusade, it probably would have been seen as a great victory for that emperor or that king, and it would have been seen as essentially a royal movement associated with the lay ruler. But because it was second rank temporal rulers who led the First Crusade on the ground, that preserved the very strong sense that it was a papal movement, a papal initiative. And therefore, when it succeeded, the boost that it gave to the prestige of the popes and to the Gregorian reform movement was quite something to behold. So the leaders of the First Crusade were the very wealthy and experienced Raymond, Count of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lorraine, Robert of Normandy, the eldest son of William the Conqueror, who we already talked about earlier, Bohemond, the son of the Norman ruler of Sicily, who was a bit of an adventurer, chancer, and Baldwin of Bouillon, who became the brother of Godfrey, who would eventually succeed him as the ruler of Jerusalem, and a number of other people as well. Anyway, they set off for Constantinople. There was in the first instance a number of very unpleasant acts of sectional violence against the Jews. Now, these were not at all supported by the popes and were generally resisted by the bishops as well. The reason they occurred is because in the sort of rather primitive mindset of the people of the time, given their social structure, they thought of the crusade in terms of an enemy having attacked the particular local patch, the domain of their paramount feudal lord, Jesus Christ. So they thought of Jerusalem as being the village that was the personal hometown of their feudal lord, and they'd most failed him that one could possibly do in feudal terms by allowing his own very own territory to be overrun by his enemies. And therefore it was now imperative for them to go and get it back for him. That's how they thought about things in terms of that feudal structure. And therefore they were whipped up into indignation and rage against the enemies of Christ. And this rage vented itself on the Jews, who were a visible presence in medieval towns and who obviously, famously, didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah. And also they were looking for money in order to pay for their expedition to the east. So attacking the Jews and extorting money from them seemed an obvious option. As I say, this doesn't affect the justice of the crusade as such, because this definitely was not intended or permitted or approved of by the authorities, but is a very regrettable and unpleasant episode in the history of the Crusades. Two main groups set out for Constantinople. The first was a sort of popular mob, the People's Crusade, which set out in the expectation of miraculous assistance to defeat the Muslims without papal authorization. And they did get to Constantinople. The emperor in Constantinople was not very pleased to see them. He could see that they had absolutely no chance against the Muslims, and but he didn't know what to do with them. He didn't want them to riot and cause trouble. So he said, so if you really want to, here are some ships. Off you go, good luck. And of course, sure enough, they were massacred and enslaved and never seen again. So that was another regrettable episode connected to the First Crusade. However, the officially sanctioned part of the First Crusade, led by these noblemen that I mentioned, set out in August of the following year from the Rhineland and marched down through the Balkans to Constantinople. They were met by the authorities of the Byzantine Empire. They were carefully channeled into Constantinople by different routes, one at a time. They were entertained royally, but they were carefully isolated from their followers, the leaders, and the emperor extorted from them oaths of loyalty to him, accepting him as their paramount leader. Now, this wasn't how things worked in the Byzantine Empire. As I say, it was an objective state. You know, you became a bureaucrat or a soldier, and you served in that structure under the leadership of the empire in the form of the emperor. It wasn't based on kinship relationships and mutual agreements to beat up each other's enemies. But Alexius understood that that's how these Westerners worked. That's how they understood things. So he tried to make sure he got oaths from them of a feudal sort in order to make sure they behaved themselves, because he was very concerned that they weren't going to behave themselves. The Crusaders eventually all agreed to perform these oaths. Alexios then had them shipped across the Bosphorus to Asia, and they besieged Nicaea. They managed to capture Nicaea, but the inhabitants of Nicaea, realizing that these rough Westerners were likely to do a great deal of damage to the place when they took the city, they managed to communicate with the Byzantine authorities in advance and surrender it to them rather than the Westerners in order to avoid any trouble. The Westerners were a bit disappointed by that, as they were rather looking forward to sacking the city. So the emperor made sure they were rewarded with lots of gold for their efforts. They then carried on across Asia Minor, and one particular incident were ended up in a very sticky position against an Islamic relief army, but out of partially clever tactics and partially good luck, they managed to win a great victory there at Dorylaeum. And this began to wake up the Islamic world to the fact that something rather concerning from their point of view was happening, but not fast enough. So one of the reasons for the success of the First Crusade is that it was just crazy. The idea that a bunch of people in armour from northwest Europe would suddenly travel across two continents and turn up in the Middle East in order to charge people on their horses in a completely random way that had bore no resemblance to the way war was fought in that region. Nobody had calculated on that. It was essentially equivalent to an alien invasion suddenly interrupting World War II. And so nobody had made preparations to deal with that. That's one of the reasons why the First Crusade was much more successful than most of the subsequent Crusades. They carried on down to the city of Antioch, very famous ancient Christian city, had been in the hands of the Byzantine Empire until pretty recently, but had been lost in the reverses which it had suffered in the second half of the 11th century. Still a majority Christian city. And they laid siege to it, but rather fruitlessly for many months. And an Islamic relief army was approaching, so their situation was getting rather desperate. It was at this point that one of the leaders of the First Crusade, Stephen of Blois, decided to give up and go home. This is one of the most fateful moments in the entire history of the church, in fact, for reasons which we'll get to in a second. But anyway, Stephen of Blois has gone off, and the rest of the Crusaders are still apparently fruitlessly besieging Antioch, and Bohemond, the chancer, slightly dodgy character who I mentioned. I say he's a chancer and a slightly dodgy character because, in fact, the Crusaders were motivated by religious motivations. You'll often hear people say, in a sort of casual, ill-informed way, that it was all really about trying to make a fortune for yourself and sort of brutal colonial adventuring or whatever. That wasn't what was behind the First Crusade. The First Crusade was genuinely a religious movement unleashed by the enormous tension created by the unhappy social organisation of Western Europe and the penitential teaching and discipline of the church, and the tension between those two suddenly being released by the crusading indulgence preached by Pope Urban II. That was where the First Crusade came from. So the people on it who, were rough and ready noblemen of the 11th century, sinners like we all are, certainly left many things to be desired, but they were genuinely motivated by spiritual motivations. The possible exception to this, almost certain exception, is Bohemond, who really was a sort of colonial adventurer and had already been fighting in the Middle East against the Byzantine Empire, well, the Near East, and against the Byzantine Empire on a number of occasions, although he was a Norman, came from southern Italy and Sicily, so he was much more familiar with the region. He really did have personal interests in those areas. Whereas the others were from, Belgium and northern France and England and such like. And for them, it was just a massively risky expedition on which they were probably going to die, and which was certainly going to cost them, more than half of their entire wealth. And if they decided to live there, they got to live in a dusty, dry, over-hot, dangerous region of the world instead of the nice rolling green fields of northern France where they came from originally. So they weren't doing it out of self-interest, other than in the sense of wanting to avoid going to purgatory or hell. But anyway, Bohemond, as I say, a bit more of a chancer. He had an arrangement with a Christian Armenian who was on the inside of the city and who was in command of a section of the wall and a tower. And he said to him, I can probably let you in through a side door here. And so Bohemond, at a council of the Crusade leaders, didn't let on to the fact that he had made this arrangement. And he said that given we're in such a difficult situation and we've got a relief army arriving soon, I think that if anyone finds a clever way of winning this siege, that person should be allowed to rule Antioch afterwards. Now, the other Crusaders were not stupid. They realised that he must have already found a clever way of ending the siege, but they were sufficiently desperate at that time that they agreed to the arrangement. Bohemond then revealed his inside man, and the Crusaders managed to capture Antioch just in time before the Islamic Relief Army arrived. But then, of course, they were subjected to siege by the Islamic Relief Army for some months after that. Now, you might ask, where is the emperor in Constantinople? Shouldn't he be helping these people out who are reviving his empire? Well, indeed. And in fact, the emperor in Constantinople had been providing them with a lot of help at a distance through his officials and soldiers. But he was intending to actually come and lead the movement, and he was on his way with an army. And it was when he was on his way with an army that he bumped into Stephen of Blois, the bad guy of ecclesiastical history, who'd run away, as we mentioned, and he was a bit embarrassed to bump into the Byzantine emperor while he was running away. And so in order to make himself look less bad, and no doubt to some degree from genuine conviction, he played up the doomedness of the Crusaders. He basically said they're stuck outside Antioch, which of course they were when he left. They don't seem to have any prospect of capturing the city. There's a relief army on the way. They're probably already dead. If you carry on to Antioch, you will die with them, and it will be the ruin of your empire. And anything you might have wanted to achieve from this expedition will be reversed with interest by the catastrophe of arriving at an already reconquered or unconquered Antioch. So Alexius, unfortunately, catastrophically, was convinced and turned back. If he had not met Stephen of Blois, or if he had not been convinced by him and had carried on to Antioch and had saved the First Crusaders from the Islamic Relief Army, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church might still be in communion to this day. But unfortunately, Alexius turned back. Now, one doesn't wish to blame him too much. He was being conned by a coward who'd run away, but it's a very tragic moment in the history of the church. Meanwhile, back in Antioch, the First Crusaders decided, look, we can't just hold out in this crusade. We're not going to survive. We don't have enough supplies. We just have to actually fight these guys. So they're buoyed by the alleged discovery of the spear that pierced our Lord's side on the cross, buried underneath the cathedral in Antioch, discovered through a revelation to one of the Crusaders. And so bearing this spear, they charged out of Antioch, and remarkably, and of course these men did spend their entire life fighting each other, training from very early childhood to be sort of killing machines, essentially. So they're not to be sniffed at. They charged out of Antioch and they defeated the large Islamic relief army. And this was obviously an enormously important victory. And so after quite a lot of deliberation, they decided, but not Bohemond, who was very happy with possessing Antioch and who now considered that he didn't owe it to the emperor because the emperor turned back and abandoned them, so he felt absolved from his oath. He stayed in Antioch as Prince of Antioch. Baldwin, the brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, had also gone off because the Armenians of Edessa had asked him to assist them against the Muslims, so he'd gone off to become Count of Edessa. So from this point, there were already 2 little Crusader statelets established in the east, but the remaining Crusaders carried on to Jerusalem. They arrived at the walls of Jerusalem on the 7th of June 1099, fell on their knees and wept. A great emotional moment for them. Now, having heard that Antioch had fallen through the treachery, in inverted commas, of the Christian population within the walls, the Muslims of Jerusalem had thrown out the Christian population of Jerusalem. As I say, all of these areas were usually either half Christian or majority Christian. So again, that's another criticism of the Crusades which you can set aside. They genuinely were liberating Christian territories, which had become Islamicized through coercion and intimidation over many centuries, but were still either half or majority Christian areas. But anyway, the Muslims in Jerusalem decided to throw out the Christians before the Crusaders arrived, which was in the long term something of a mistake, because it meant that the Crusaders didn't think they had to worry about any of the population of that city. The Crusaders besieged Jerusalem from the beginning of June until the middle of July, and eventually they decided to make a final assault, strengthened and emboldened by the arrival of lots of new provisions, helpfully sent by an English fleet, which landed on the coast of the Holy Land. And they marched around the walls of Jerusalem, Joshua style, in a series of processions, and then they threw themselves into the final assault, with Godfrey of Bouillon entering the city first by having himself catapulted 1930s Hollywood movie style onto the walls by a catapult, one of these huge military besieging engines. And apparently, well, certainly there was a pretty bloody sack of the city, although some sources say that Godfrey himself did not participate in it, but went immediately to pray in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Some of the accounts, especially some of those which are most frequently quoted, are clearly poetic exaggerations. If you want to check up on the argument around this, there are many sources for you to look at. So there we are. That's the conclusion of the First Crusade. Godfrey of Bouillon refused to take the title King of Jerusalem because he said that Christ is the King of Jerusalem, so he took the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, which interestingly, the title Advocate, meaning lay protector of a church, was a title which was used by the founder of Cluny Abbey back in, which had initiated this whole movement of reform in the church back in 910. William Duke of Aquitaine, had taken the title Advocate of Cluny, so he was, whether consciously or unconsciously, alluding to the very origins of this great reform movement in the church by taking that title. In fact, Godfrey died only a year later after making a number of additional conquests and establishing the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He didn't have any children, so he was succeeded by his brother Baldwin, Count of Edessa, and an additional territory, Tripoli, was conquered by Raymond of Toulouse. So there ended up being 4 Crusader states which covered Israel and Lebanon and a few other places in modern terms in the Middle East. So that was the First Crusade. People were absolutely astounded at its success. Urban II actually died after the capture of Jerusalem, but before he could find out about it. But in Europe in general, the reaction was hysterical. It was described as the greatest event since the resurrection. It was the ultimate triumph of this Gregorian reform movement of the papacy. In all of its quarrels with temporal rulers and corrupt clerics, it was seen to have been vindicated by divine favour through the recapture of the lost city of Jerusalem.